Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad to see so many of you came back for this very timely topic of China's innovation and technology. So I'm curious to know, though, if any of you have ever checked into a hotel and then remembered something when you got to the room. So you called the front desk and asked for, say, a towel. And then a few minutes later, the bell rings, and you open the door and see one of these. Has anybody seen what you have? A few? Yes, actually quite a few. So this is a robot. So a robot, say, carrying your towel or whatever you requested. And that happened to me last fall when Paul and I were traveling in China. And when I saw this neatly dressed guy, I knew that surprising things were happening in China in technology, and I wanted to know more. So during that trip, Paul and I traveled mainly by high-speed rail with maximum speeds of 220 miles per hour, that's 350 kilometers per hour, far faster than the fastest train in the US. So on the Chinese train, we never lost internet connectivity through cellular because of China's pervasive, strong 5G network. And also, I was able to pay for expenses using WeChat Pay. How many of you have tried it? Quite a few, either WeChat Pay or Alipay. So most people back home don't realize that China has this cashless system, and Chinese people don't use credit cards. They use this. So, of course, nobody should calculate technological superiority by the tourist experience. But it gave me a window into how China's advances in technology were improving everyday life. So, I'm glad you're here with me today to address this key question. To what extent is China catching up with or even surpassing the West in science and technology? And why does it matter? But first, who am I? You've heard me a few times. I'm not a tech bro or a scientist or a military expert. But because I'm a writer with a background in journalism, my specialty is taking very complex topics and trying to explain them in language that we all can understand. So I was trained to be objective and to look at each issue from multiple viewpoints. And that's what I'm doing today. So my goal today is to explain China's progress in science and technology in terms that make sense to you, and to give you a broader perspective on China than you might have had before. So, why is it that there's been so much focus on China in technology lately? So, for one, China is the only country pushing the boundaries of science and technology that is not a U.S. ally. Instead, as you know, in recent years, many leaders have called it an adversary. And that's not because it's likely to attack the United States homeland, to be clear, but mainly because it has a different political system than we do, and one that we, frankly, don't understand very well, and that some of our leaders distrust. But more importantly, because China is testing and showing off newly developed military might. So, of course, China has a different perspective. So I'm going to broaden out to both those perspectives. For the Chinese, technology is more than pride and prestige, although, of course, those things do matter a lot. But the goal of Beijing's leaders is not to overtake America. Those are words that we in the West use, not the Chinese. Instead of just churning out cheap consumer goods, as they have for so many decades, The Chinese want to make things with a higher rate of return to raise incomes and living standards. President Xi Jinping says his goal is the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So behind that strong drive is a painful history. China missed the first two industrial revolutions. Beijing knows it has a lot of catch-up to do. So it's aiming not to go in the same order we did, but to leapfrog ahead to today's technological revolutions and regain what President Xi considers to be China's rightful place as a strong nation. He says his goal is greater self-reliance through science and technology. And another pain point for the Chinese, the U.S. policy of containing China, both militarily and economically. To Beijing, that feels like economic coercion, one country trying to deliberately hold back progress in another. Let's jump right in, though, to technology with the cool stuff. Well-known technologies where China's been grabbing headlines in the news lately. First, artificial intelligence, or AI. So how close is China to catching up with the US? So you may have seen some of these headlines last December in the Washington Post. China's DeepSeek disrupts American plans for AI dominance. The Wall Street Journal, how China's DeepSeek outsmarted America. So just a year ago, Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO, warned that China was just 2 to 3 years behind the US in AI. But then this bombshell dropped. Last December, a small group of about 100 developers in China, most of them in their early 20s, released their version of AI called DeepSeek R1. And this news caused a steep drop in the US stock market, which in a few days lost $1 trillion in value. Ouch. So why? American experts who looked at DeepSeek examined it and said that it performed just as well as OpenAI's much-admired ChatGPT, the US leader. And yet, DeepSeek was developed by an obscure Chinese company with far less money and ostensibly using computers with less advanced chips. That shocked a lot of people. And this DeepSeek moment set off a frenzy of US investments trying to retain our lead. Some personal observations here. I've downloaded both DeepSeek and ChatGPT onto my laptop and asked similar questions. In fact, I used them for the research for this talk, not the writing. I would never do that, but the research. And I asked them similar questions, or the same questions. And both of them gave me excellent responses in good English. Because there's so many different technologies here, I wanted to make sure I could sum it up accurately, sum each of them up accurately. So today, Eric Schmidt says that China is rapidly closing the gap. Chinese companies rival the US in something called generative AI models, sometimes called large language models. And that, just put very simply, is the kind that we're likely to use on smartphones and desktop computers, and the kind that China has already started applying in factories to improve productivity. But, Eric Schmidt points out, China has not yet surpassed Americans in the more advanced artificial general intelligence. That is the kind that usually requires a powerful supercomputer and may one day do human-like reasoning and learning. And he says that it's crucial for the US to get to that more advanced threshold first. But remember, DeepSeek is not the only competitor in China. At home, it's running the race against very big Chinese companies like Baidu and Alibaba and ByteDance, as well as a host of small startups flying under the radar. So Chinese government and private venture capital firms have invested hundreds of billions of dollars in AI, as have Americans. So now for our second headline grabber, semiconductors. You've probably read a lot about this too. So how goes the competition in semiconductors, the tiny chips that make computers work? US companies such as NVIDIA are far ahead in the design of the tiniest, most advanced chips. And China can't yet make the lithography machines needed to manufacture that kind of really advanced chip. And Beijing is well aware that this is one of China's biggest vulnerabilities, and it's investing heavily to catch up. Still, although Americans invented semiconductors and still design the most advanced ones, US capacity to manufacture them, which is the big gray line going from 1990 to estimated to 2030, the amount of semiconductors actually made in the US has fallen dramatically over the years. And over the last 6 years, the US has tried to choke off China's access to our most leading-edge logic chips and manufacturing equipment, hoping to block its progress and bring production back home. China's response? An all-out push towards self-sufficiency. If the West won't sell it to them, they'll figure out how to make it themselves. So in 2023, the Chinese tech company Huawei grabbed world attention when it announced it had designed an advanced processor chip made in China as small as 7 nanometers. Now, obviously, this chart is way bigger than 7 nanometers, but I want to give you a sense of the difference between 7 and 5 and 3 and 2, which I'm going to be talking about in a minute. But most Americans thought a 7 nanometer, that China was not even close to manufacturing a 7 nanometer chip. And now China is reportedly working on 5 nanometer chips. But China cannot yet design or make the tiniest, most complex chips. And Korea's Samsung and Taiwan's TSMC, which manufacture chips designed by US companies, are already mass producing 3 nanometer chips, and they've announced a plan to make 2 nanometer chips this year, as has Intel. So you can see just the relative size of these tiny chips, but the description of a nanometer it's so tiny, I can't even describe it or fathom it. So what is more fun than AI or chips? Robots. You probably missed the Chinese New Year TV extravaganza last February. During that televised special, hundreds of millions of people in China were wowed by dancing robots. I wish I could show you the video with music, but it's copyright protected and not downloadable. So here are some still clips. The robots interacted with human dancers in real time on TV, on live TV, and showed some amazing agility and coordination. And this happens to be a traditional dance that included red scarves. And the robots could even twirl their scarves and toss them up and catch them. So I encourage you to Google or look up dancing robots on YouTube and watch this clip with the music. It's really fun. So those robots were made by a Chinese company called Unitree, which is also known for its robots that can play soccer, or as the rest of the world calls it, football. So China's humanoid soccer robots can kick a ball, run, change directions, and even stand back up after falling. Like other countries, China's been investing heavily in humanoid robots, with startups and tech giants both entering the field. And they're approaching, but not quite there, the sophistication of robots in Japan and the US. So far less glitzy, but more impactful, is China's focus on industrial robots. So we're so used to associating Chinese with cheap labor that you might be surprised to learn that they're rapidly automating their factories. And because China has more factories than anyone else, 6 million factories, China is now installing factory robots at a far greater pace than any other country. And instead of importing most of them, as it has in the past, Chinese companies are starting now to manufacture more. Now they can manufacture more than half of the factory robots that China buys in a given year. Now, this is a terrible picture, but it's the newest news, which is AI-driven dark factories. I guess it's really hard to take a picture in a dark factory. Some of China's factories are 100% automated, so they operate with no lights. Technically, you couldn't take a picture at all in a real one. So no humans work on the production lines at all. Now, Japan and Germany pioneered lights-out manufacturing a few years ago. But this new factory near Beijing is slightly different. It reportedly has an AI brain that can autonomously diagnose and fix problems, all in the dark. Now for another headline grabber, electric cars. Perhaps you've noticed, I'm sure you have, I've talked to many of you who say you have, Chinese streets have thousands of nearly silent electric vehicles. So electric cars and trucks are easy to spot. You've all been told this with the green license plate. I've heard from several of you that how many green license plates you've seen, especially in Shanghai. So as you continue to travel around China, keep looking for those. The blue ones are gas-powered, and the green ones are electric. So where bicycles once reigned, remember China had a lot of bicycles at one point, but now there are a lot of electric scooters gliding silently along China's streets, or sometimes on the sidewalks, which they're not supposed to, and it's kind of a hazard to pedestrians. I don't know if you've been warned about that or almost run over by one. And you may have seen these rows of identical scooters parked on the sidewalks. And they're available for rent for as little as 64 US cents an hour. So today, China's electric car companies rank among the world's best. Nearly half of all new cars sold in China are electric, including both battery electric and plug-in hybrids. And that makes China the world's largest market for electric vehicles, which includes not just cars, but also trucks and buses and scooters. So by contrast, only about 20% of new cars sold in the US were electric. And many Americans don't like electric cars. I'm not sure if there are any of you out there, because the US lacks enough public charging stations to make it easy for electric car owners to drive long distances. And China's government kind of jumped ahead of the curve on this by installing charging stations throughout the country. So it's much more convenient for them to use electric cars. And the world leader in manufacturing electric cars is a company little known in the US called BYD, which stands for Build Your Dream, or your dreams, as we've heard from some of our tour guides. It's interesting because BYD is the name, and yet that's English, but they still use that name in China. And worldwide, BYD surpassed Tesla in total EV productions 2 years ago. And the cheapest BYD electric car sells for just under $10,000 US in China. So imagine buying one for that price. So today, BYD and a host of lots of other Chinese electric car companies are selling like hotcakes, not just in China, but around the world, except in the US, where they're not available. But you can keep watching for them on Chinese roads. So electric car batteries have, in recent months, also been a headline grabber. China produces more than 70% of all the world's batteries for electric cars. And the key component, as many of you know, in most of these batteries is lithium ion, which stores and releases the energy. China not only manufactures more of these batteries than any other country, it also dominates the processing of the key battery materials, such as lithium, cobalt, and graphite. And recently, China's export controls on these critical minerals have made Americans very aware of what strong leverage Beijing has. Okay, let's slow down for a minute. How did China get to be so competitive in so many of these advanced technologies? Let's go back and look at that. So when I first reported on China back in the 80s, China was woefully backward in just about every technology imaginable. Starting in the 80s and 90s, China began, as you know, low-cost production of shoes and toys. Most recently, it's started producing more sophisticated goods like laptops and smart TVs. And during those years, the common view was the US innovates, China imitates. And this was true for many years. A US or Japanese or European company would invent something and then hire a Chinese company to produce it at lower cost. And then sometimes a Chinese rival company would pop up making a very similar product and then export it back at even lower cost. This happened in industry after industry, creating much bitterness. But now, times are changing. Techies use this term called 0 to 1 to describe pure inventions of groundbreaking products. And by contrast, 1 to N represents the process of taking someone else's invention, scaling up the production, and creating even better versions for the global market. China did not invent semiconductors or robots or electric cars. Instead, as you know, China's main strength has been in 1 to N innovations, not so much pure invention of the initial 0 to 1. But now experts are noticing the Chinese are already starting to truly innovate. So what changed to make that possible? So to answer that, let's go back to the factories and into the labs. Leave the factories and go into the labs. As you know, you can't catch up on innovation without basic scientific research and development. And since 2017, see that red line, China's spending on R&D increased at a double-digit growth for 7 consecutive years. That's that strong red line. And last year, China spent about $500 billion, triple from the amount when Xi Jinping took office in 2012. So as you can see, that's still less than the total spending of the US, but China is catching up very rapidly and spending money to do so. That's for basic scientific research in the lab. But how do you manage the quality and compare China to other countries in science? Last year, The Economist magazine did a deep dive into the rise of Chinese science, with interesting results. It concluded that China is now a leading scientific power. Did you ever think you'd hear that sentence? Who knew? And it noted that China's scientists produce some of the world's best research, particularly in chemistry, physics, and materials sciences. So wait a sec. How do experts make a judgment like that? So one way is by ranking universities by overall scientific impact. I don't know if you can read this list very well, but the Leiden ranking, which is based in the Netherlands, publishes a list for every branch of science and ranks every university in the world on the research output, and that includes research in all languages. So when all science categories were combined, 12 of the top 14 universities are in China. I don't know if you can see that list very well. Harvard is number 2. University of Toronto is down there at number 8. Number 1 on the list was Zhejiang University. So how many of you have ever heard of Zhejiang University? Not too many, but it's number 1 on this list. So another way to measure pure scientific output is by research output, which is the number of high-impact papers produced each year. So that is research papers in prestigious journals, cited most often by other scientists. So back in 2013, Americans produced about 4 times as many such papers as China. But today, according to U.S. National Science Board, Chinese scientists contribute more papers in prestigious journals than their colleagues from either America or Britain or Germany, and they produce more work that's highly cited. Does that surprise you? It surprised me when I found that out. So what about different fields of science? You might think that the Western world would lead in the natural sciences and medicine, right? And that's still mainly true. The renowned London-based nature journal Nature ranks research universities in various scientific fields. And in the latest ranking, overall, including 5 different scientific fields, Harvard ranked first, but Chinese universities won 8 of the top 10 spots, as you can see if your eyes are good enough. In biology, though, the US universities had 10 of the top 10 spots. And in health sciences, US, Canada, and Europe had 8 of the top 10. But by contrast, Chinese universities outranked the West in chemistry, physical sciences, and earth and environmental sciences. Still, Chinese are not just toiling away in the labs. The writers of some of these technical papers, plus some geniuses outside universities, have been filing patents. China's patent applications, see that red line? That's China's patent applications in recent decades. And this is according to data from the World Intellectual Property Organizations. China's patent applications accounted for more than half the global total in 2021. So why the surge in Chinese research and development in recent years? Well, in part because China's been opening more universities and investing heavily in advanced research labs. Back in 1990, only about 4% of college-age students in China went to college. And China had fewer than 600 universities. And today, China has more than 3,000 universities and colleges, and about 60% of its college-age youth are enrolled. Plus, China is educating massive numbers of young people in science and technology. It's hard to find directly comparable numbers, but this chart from a US think tank shows that even back in 2020, China was graduating 4 times more students than the US in STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. So in engineering alone, China grants over 1.2 million degrees every year, which is 7 times as many as the US. So this is where it's coming from. So although many of China's best and brightest studied in the US and stayed, many others in recent years have started returning to China with degrees from top US universities. In fact, in recent years, more scientists have been returning to China than leaving China. And some are lured by incentives. Universities offer bonuses and grants to get labs up and running. And as an example, this biologist, whose name is Yen Ning, resigned from her tenured professorship at Princeton in 2022 to become the founding dean of the Shenzhen Medical Academy. Come on over, we'll let you start up a new medical academy. And on Chinese social media, the news attracted more than 440 million views by the next day, including one comment, "Yen Ning, my goddess, welcome back to China." So that's the kind of excitement the Chinese feel about this trend. So you won't be surprised to hear that China's researchers also benefit from strong central government support, and much of this is investment in high-tech research equipment. And this photo shows one major example, which is China boasts of having the world's largest and most sensitive radio telescope. It's actually in a natural depression in a remote province of China, and it helps astronomers detect more distant and fainter objects in the sky. So let's get back to some of the technologies where China has taken a surprising lead. Electric cars are just one sign of China's huge commitment to green energy. China's made major advances in solar, wind, and nuclear power. But first, some sobering context. China remains the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And China continues to build new coal-fired power plants, like this one, chugging out air pollution, while most countries have stopped. But at the same time, Beijing has gone all in on deploying renewable energy. So over the last 4 years, more than half the world's new solar power installation were in China. Also, 60% of the world's wind power installations. So this rapid expansion allowed China to hit its 2030 clean energy target 6 years ahead of schedule. And in solar energy, China is the undisputed world leader, producing 84% of the world's solar panels. And China also dominates the production and supply chain of key components, as well as the machinery needed to produce them. It's rapidly expanding installation of solar panels here in China, with a total solar electric capacity that's more than the rest of the world combined. And in China, solar power has a surprising side effect: the greening of deserts. What? So deep in the desert of northern China, there's a lot of desert in China, once totally barren, this massive installation of solar panels is not only generating power, but it's also creating shade under which they grow, in this particular case, catch this, goji berries, which are prized in Chinese medicine for aiding a long and healthy life. I'm curious, how many of you ever heard of goji berries? Oh, quite a few of you. I had not. Okay, now for wind power. So likewise, China is the undisputed global leader in both production and installation of wind power, surpassing all other countries by a wide margin. As of last year, China had installed more gigawatts of wind power than the next 5 countries combined. And that includes both onshore and a rapidly growing offshore sector. We saw some of these in that windy city of Pingtan. Do you remember that? Both the US and EU continue expanding their wind power too, but they struggle with supply chains because they rely heavily on China for parts. So how about nuclear power. Here, China is pushing ahead with both installation and also research. So in nuclear power capacity, the US and France remain ahead of China, installed capacity. But China leads in new installations with 27 nuclear reactors under construction right now and ambitious plans for 120 more in the next 10 years. And by contrast, the US and France have no reactors currently under construction, although several are in the planning stages now. So historically, China has relied mainly on imported Western technologies for nuclear plants from Westinghouse, from France. But now China has a home-built nuclear reactor called Hualong 1, which is what this picture is, and it's in operation. And it's using a design, the Chinese design, to build many more power plants just like this one at a lower cost and in half the time that's needed in the US and Europe. So hoping to lead into the future, China has made some significant strides in developing advanced nuclear reactor technologies. So notably, it's already operating the world's first fourth-generation nuclear power plant, which is a high-temperature gas-cooled reactor. And China has also built, separately, and is testing a thorium-fueled reactor and has made significant breakthroughs in research on nuclear fusion. I realize this means more to a few of you than it does to the majority, but it's an important move for China. So let's move on to China's eye-popping prestige projects. So when speaking to his people, here are 4 big government-funded projects that President Xi loves to boast about. So first, China has sent a rover to the far side of the moon. Many Americans don't realize that China has landed spacecraft on the moon 4 times already, and in its latest landing was the first ever on the moon's far side. And it sent back not only photos, but lunar samples. And a far side landing is tricky because it's difficult to communicate back to Earth. Second, China operates the world's only other space station. So today there are 2 space stations orbiting the Earth, and this is the one that we hear about. It's the International Space Station, a collaborative project between 15 countries and 5 space agencies. Russians built and launched the original section, and then subsequent modules were added by the US and Japan and Europe. And it's been continuously inhabited since the year 2000, with astronauts and visitors from 22 different countries, but not China. Why not? Back in 2011, the US Congress barred China from participating in it. So, China designed and built its own space station. It's called Tiangong, which means Heavenly Palace, and it was completed 2 years ago. And it's now a permanently crewed, long-term space station expected to orbit for another 10 to 15 years. And that is well past the date when the International Space Station is due to be decommissioned in 2030. So third, exploring Mars. Chinese on Mars? What's that all about? Chinese, it might surprise you to hear that this is already happening. This is actually a selfie taken by Zhurong, China's rover, deployed by a Chinese spacecraft that made a soft landing on the surface of Mars in May of 2021. And talk about a space race. In 2021, China's spacecraft arrived at Mars just 3 months after NASA's latest landing. And that made China the second country to land a rover on Mars. And sometime in 2028, China's hoping to send a second spacecraft to Mars to return the rover's samples back to Earth. So fourth, closer to home, China has its own navigation system. So if you take a taxi in a Chinese city, you may notice that the driver uses a navigation system that constantly chatters in Chinese. And this is not GPS as we know it. China has its own version called Beidou, which is their word for the Big Dipper. So why reinvent the wheel? During the 1990s, the Chinese realized that the US Navy was blocking GPS access for a Chinese cargo ship and stranding it and making it impossible to navigate. Yikes. So that prompted Beijing to make a decision to develop its own satellite navigation system, Beidou. And now Beijing is exporting that system to many other countries in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Okay, you followed me so far. Now I'm moving on to something mind-boggling: quantum computing and satellites. So in 2016, 10 years ago, nearly 10 years ago, China launched the world's first quantum communications satellite. Now, it's based on laws of quantum physics, so that any attempt to intercept or measure the quantum data disturbs it and alerts the parties involved. And the goal is to create the ultimate global, unhackable internet. Definitely a plus for national security. Please, no technical questions on this. I've just said the most I know how to say on this. I can barely understand what I just said to you, and this image totally mystifies me. So I could go on and on. In fact, the original version of this talk would have lasted 2 hours, and I've almost run out of time to discuss passenger aircraft. So after years of effort, China's way behind in passenger aircraft, but they're making some progress. After years of effort, China achieved its first passenger plane that was approved and in service, that they call the 919, and it's a single-aisle plane similar to the Boeing 737. And Chinese are still working on developing a wide-body jet and jet engines. Those are in the process, but they're not there yet. And they're far behind in general in aircraft, but when this comes online, it's already being offered for sale to other countries. That can pose a competitive threat to both Boeing and Airbus in the future. So when it comes to military innovations, a little bit less is known. It's harder to get information on this. But the US, as you know, is far more advanced than any other nation. But China has been testing and deploying some innovations that the Pentagon is watching very closely. And this is China's 6th generation stealth fighter. It's a flying delta with no tail, and its likely goal is to rival US jets such as the F-35, and it's still being tested. Second, China boasts that it's developed and deployed a hypersonic missile before the US or Russia did that travels faster than the speed of sound. By the time you've detected it, it's too late to stop it. And this is very hard to achieve. Third, China has also developed a different missile that's designed to destroy aircraft carriers. So that missile can maneuver after takeoff, changing course to hit a moving target like ships. Instead of just going like that, it goes up and then kind of moves around so that it can hit a ship. And since China deployed it, the US Navy moved quite a few of its aircraft carriers out of the Taiwan Straits and away from China's coast. So finally, life-saving biotech innovations. China used to lag far behind in biotech, but in recent years, it has advanced quickly, and its biologists are pushing the boundaries in pharmaceutical research. So last February, the Wall Street Journal ran an article called "The Drug Industry is Having Its Own Deep-Seek Moment." So a drug licensed by a little-known Chinese biotech outperformed Merck's blockbuster therapy Keytruda in a lung cancer trial. And the Wall Street Journal concluded that Chinese biotechs are now developing drugs faster and cheaper than their US counterparts. And a decade from now, many drugs hitting the US market will have originated in Chinese labs. So biotech research is beyond me, quite frankly, but this list shows some of the other advances that Chinese researchers have made. So what have we learned overall about China's tech innovation? First, until recently, many Western leaders assumed that pure research could not flourish in an authoritarian system, but it has. Plus, we've seen that China no longer is just a copycat. While it cannot boast of very many 0 to 1 pure inventions, it has become an innovator with impressive breakthroughs in ideas and solutions. And those who still say China doesn't innovate, it only steals, haven't been keeping up with the news. So how worried should Americans and their allies be? At some level, most scientific breakthroughs are good for the well-being of all humankind and should be celebrated and shared. People in every country benefit from advances in disease prevention and treatment, as well as green technology. But it does matter where the breakthroughs occur for two reasons. First, who reaps the rewards? What companies from which countries profit from selling goods based on cutting-edge technology? And that profit motive has long driven technological progress in the West, and it now also drives Chinese entrepreneurs. So Western companies are very closely following the news out of China. And second, military security. The US has been trying hard to keep its military-related breakthroughs away from the Chinese, and that's getting harder to do. So in the future, which countries gain advantage from, say, hypersonic weapons, or quantum satellites, or missiles that can hit moving ships, or biological weapons? As long as war is possible, every major power feels compelled to develop its own military technology, if possible, to own it and control it. So all of this should be a wake-up call to the people of the United States and its allies. Our governments and our private tech companies need to take action to make sure we continue to innovate and maintain our competitiveness. So what can help? Here are some of my ideas. So first, more awareness of just where our biggest vulnerabilities lie and where our strengths are. The US still retains an advantage over China in software, biotech, and AI. Second, we need more funding, both government and private sector, for basic scientific research and product development. Third, more patient long-term investments in our own countries, definitely in high-tech manufacturing, but also in the infrastructure needed to support it. And finally, more investment in science and technology education and in workforce training, as well as continuing to attract and retain highly capable immigrant scientists and tech experts from around the world. So it's competitiveness, not containment, that will keep the US strong. But don't just take my word for it. For those of you with a deep interest in the topic, I highly recommend reading this article, which just came out a few weeks ago in Foreign Affairs magazine, written by two long-term analysts of the Chinese economy. They give their recommendations for what Washington might do to strengthen US capacity for high-tech innovation. It's in the current edition, which is September, October 2025. Bigger picture, though, and this is my hope. Why not work together? So let's imagine and create a world where the US and China cooperate to enlarge the potential of human destiny in this century. Maybe, just maybe, the world is big enough for all of us to thrive and progress. May it be so. Once again, I'll go out in the back so that I know we have a port talk coming up. I don't want to interfere with that.